Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to focus on something that I think is quite fun, but you maybe you won't, I don't know, who knows? And that is the idea of unreliable narrators. I partly was thinking about this because I was reading a book recently, The Black Prince by Murdoch, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the narrator in that book is so unreliable in so many different ways that I thought it would be really interesting to talk a little bit about those and about some of my favourite examples. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's worth kind of looking at a few of my favourites where I think it's been especially well done. And I also just want to hear from you about any others that you've really enjoyed. In some ways, that might obviously be a spoiler for some books, so I am aware, the list of all the books mentioned are just below. So if you want to quickly pause and have a look, just so I don't accidentally ruin any twists, I don't think it would ruin it too much for most of these books. But just so you're aware, because I don't want to completely ruin a book that you've not read. Rather appropriately, my phone decided to be incredibly unreliable and just turned itself off when it still had plenty of battery. So that paused there, and luckily I wasn't left just talking to myself for a while. Not for too long, at least. But unreliable narrators. So they can come in many shapes and sizes, and there are many different sort of definitions for what would make a narrator unreliable. Some people kind of break it down into these sort of 5 points, which I'll sort of roughly try and go over. But essentially the large idea is that you cannot trust what the narrator is telling you for some kind of reason. So either that is because they are someone who wildly exaggerates. That may be to make their story seem more interesting. It may be for kind of reasons of self-aggrandizement. It may be that they know that they were in the wrong and they're trying to shield it by kind of hyping up some other part of the story, or anything like that, where you get these kind of bragging kind of characters who are so sort of big and whatever. It may be that characters also, these narrators don't know all of the facts, and sometimes that's for a very good reason, because they may be very young, and we'll see a couple of examples of that. They may be naive in some way, or they may not have been party to some of the other actions taking place. But often we as the audience know a little bit more than those narrators in that case. So a really good example that I'll talk a little bit more about later is Room by Emma Donoghue, in which the narrator is a really young child, and a really young child who's been kept in a basement pretty much since birth. I think actually, yeah, since birth. So they don't know much about the outside world. And so we cannot trust them in a really positive way. We understand that right from the beginning. But when they describe something that's happening, we know that it's because it's outside of their field of knowledge, right? So when they say that they think something's upsetting or sad, we know actually a little bit further why that's sad, or we know maybe what this reality is like for the young child, and that can be quite tricky. You've also got characters who kind of mislead the reader in quite a malicious way. So that can often be that they really want to paint themselves as being better. It might be that they are trying to destroy the reputation of somebody else, and it might be, again, sort of self-preservation, where they actually really want to argue that they are better than they are, because they know that doing so would hopefully impugn the character of somebody else and get them off the hook. And then again, there are some really fun examples of that. I mean, again, sometimes there are characters who just don't understand anything that's going on, which is very relatable, and is essentially me on a daily basis, having no clue really what's happening, but still somehow making it. So, well done, I got dressed today, that's impressive. But there are some characters in some books where they don't know for that exact reason. They're either too arrogant to see it, they actively try not to see something, or that they are just oblivious in some form because they don't have the full sort of set of knowledge that's out there. And I find books with unreliable narrators so often so interesting. I mean, there have been some that I don't think maybe have necessarily worked for me, but on the whole, some books that I absolutely adore are a few that have these really unreliable narrators for various reasons that I think are fascinating, particularly when a writer does it really well, because then you get this whole narrative being created around you, but essentially two narratives: the one that the narrator is telling you, and the one that you realize is real and that you start to believe. Sometimes there are multiple, sometimes there are even more, where you're not quite sure who to believe from many characters. And that, I think, is really fascinating. So let's go on to the book that made me think about this and made me want to do this, The Black Prince by Iris Murdoch. Now, I spoke a little bit about it in my February wrap-up, and I will be speaking about it again soon in a 1973 Booker shortlist video, so I won't go into too much detail about the main plot, but essentially there is a writer, a fairly unsuccessful one, who is writing to the reader, and you realise as the book's going on that he is talking to you directly, because he is caught up in various kind of crimes and acts that have happened, and we get at the beginning of the book a preface, and then at the end and an editor's note, and we get at the end various postscripts from other characters in the book, and those postscripts really disagree with each other. So you've got lots of characters who are essentially saying, no, my side of the events is true, and here's what really happened. And somewhere in the middle, you kind of piece together what might be right, because there are some where you have to sort of deduct them from the equation almost. So one character will say, oh, actually, of course I didn't do that because I was too busy doing this. And you think, actually, this character's quite self-aggrandizing, so they would say that. I mean, actually, I think what's really clever about Iris Murdoch's The Black Prince is how she basically manages to tick off almost all of the various forms of how an unreliable narrator can be in one fell swoop. You've got a character who is... well, most of the characters are sort of acting out of self-preservation because they don't want to go to jail from a high-profile court case. But they are all trying to convince themselves and others that they weren't part of it, or that their side of the history is true. So you've kind of got this selfish angle. You've got a couple of characters who are so blinded by love or by affection for other characters that they tell different sides of the story. So, for example, we get this one man who is in love with this male narrator, or the main kind of narrator of the book, and he kind of is convinced that part of the story is true because that works in his mind and, you know, tallies with his story, but also there's a part that isn't true because obviously the narrator is clearly hiding his feelings of love for this other character, and clearly he is only doing, you know, he's only hiding various things out of repressed feelings of love and kind of Freudian feelings around kind of repression around his homosexuality, and you've got that alongside his ex-wife who is sort of saying, well, no, I'm brilliant, why would I do any of this stupid stuff? And you've got another character who's saying, oh no, I was in love with him, but it worked out this way. And I just think it's so funny and really clever, and so for me that's what makes Iris Murdoch's The Black Prince so effective, is the story, you know, the main story is fun and is interesting, and would work regardless of whether it was an unreliable narrator or not. But the fact that the main character is so desperate over 400 pages to explain to us why he is right, why he acted completely out of he did all the right things, he did it out of, you know, out of really good values or morals, he acted in the right way, and people kind of deceived him. You sort of start to think maybe that's not quite true. He's spending a lot of time telling you this, and we find out towards the end he's writing this from prison. But there's also this kind of rather esoteric editor's note that is basically sort of saying, you know, this character, you know, the main character told me all of this stuff, and so I've got it written and I've gone through his book and blah, blah, blah. But we actually never find out who this editor is, and that adds an extra layer. Is this narrator deceiving us by creating an editor who's not real, who can kind of shield a lot of other stuff, which reminds me a lot of Mark Z. Danielewski's The House of Leaves, where you've got stories within a story within a story, and the constant references to an editor start to make us think that this is something real, but then the editor doesn't seem to understand various things. So, for example, the editor is looking through, and when a character says, "Oh yes, you know, this article relates to this film," the editor can't find evidence of this film existing. But is that the editor hiding this, or is this the reality? And it's so sort of layered and interesting that it's really fun to sort of see how these things are hidden. So I really love when books do this very, very well. Another example in a similar way, and you may have heard me talk about this book before because I love it, and it is a Booker Prize winner, you know, shoot me, which is A Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes. Now, I love Julian Barnes anyway, and this was the book that when I read it when I was probably 17, 18 or so, I can't remember, not long after it came out. And I must have been older than that because it came out in 2011. But I was so blown away by this book because essentially all the way through we have this character who is so kind of almost snarky. We like quite early on we start to get the sense that his sense of reality is not quite real, either legitimately because he just hasn't realized what's happening around him, or actually because he doesn't want to admit to himself how horrible he is as a person, or even that he's such a terrible man that he doesn't realize how terrible he's being. And so this sets up a really interesting moment towards the end of the book where we already have sort of started to distrust him because we see his interactions with other characters, particularly women, where he will sort of say, "Oh, you know, well, obviously it's blah blah blah," and the women around him are kind of like, "Oh, for goodness sake," you know. And at first we sort of think, you know, maybe he's just got kind of strange friendships and people don't really get him, maybe. But I think we do realize fairly soon into that you know, he keeps on going to this one woman, his ex-wife I believe it is, for support and for help, and initially she's really helpful, and eventually she's just like, "Look, you need to sort this out on your own. Like you're bringing me into this and you're trying to get me to sign off on something that you've not even really thought about." And that's really interesting and really powerful. And so I absolutely adore this book, as again you may have heard me talk about several hundred times. It's only like 150 pages long, and what's so powerful about it is we realize some of the implications of him not understanding what's happening around him right at the end in what feels like such a brilliant twist. And we can feel him. I think this is what's so great about this book for me. It's so visceral as we watch this character fall further and further into a bit of a pit, and does not realize what's happening around him. And everyone, I mean, there's a great moment, one of my favorite moments in the whole book is someone he briefly dated when he was younger, who then went and dated his best friend, and he's had sort of nothing but this sort of seething hatred for her, or a kind of a real feeling that she's horrible, and he tried to destroy their relationship. He sent a letter that was really horrible and barbed, and he doesn't remember too much of the letter. He just sort of thinks, "Oh, I wrote this sort of silly thing," and I'm sure they read it and thought it was ridiculous. But then he sees parts of the letter and realizes how awful it was, and we, especially as an audience, realize just how horrible and terrible that letter is. But the main character is again kind of like, "Oh, you know, it's quite bad, but you know, you should have seen what she did." And we start to realize a bit more what's going on here. But anyway, the moment that I really love towards the end of the book is where the penny starts dropping for us as the readers, and this ex of his turns to him and just says, "You just don't get it, do you?" And he takes that away and he's sort of like, "Well, of course I get it. I don't know what she's talking about." And we as the audience are like, "Oh, right." We start to see how wrong he's been. And that's what makes the second read of this book so brilliant for me, is you go back into the book thinking, okay, I know not to trust him now. And now when I read it without trusting him, certain other details come to light. So I absolutely adore this book, as you may have guessed. And I think it's really worth reading for that reason, to kind of see just how well things are hidden under the surface, particularly hidden under the surface of his understanding through his own arrogance, and his own desire for sort of self-preservation and self-aggrandizement. And I just think it's brilliant. So I mentioned Room earlier, by Emma Donoghue, and another book that has a really similar feel in some ways in terms of the level of the narrator being unreliable is Bryony from Atonement, which again I spoke about fairly recently, another book, a shortlisted book, by Ian McEwan. And in Atonement, this main character, Bryony, we see everything through her eyes. particularly at the beginning. And I mean, it's a slightly different form of an unreliable narrator, in that in the beginning of the book, she's really unreliable. And then part 2 of the book is sort of fast forward to many years down the line, where she's suddenly a lot more reliable. But her as a young child, I think she's about 11, I want to say, or 10. And so all of her unreliability comes from her not understanding what's going on in front of her. She sees her brother, so her sister rather, with her boyfriend, with her, you know, her sister's boyfriend, and she thinks that he is attacking her, when actually they're having sex in this library, or kind of making out, or whatever. Later on, she thinks she sees someone attacking. She thinks she sees a kind of shadow going off in the dark after someone's been attacked, and she again is then convinced that it must be this character, because who else would it be? And I think it's called Robbie. I want to say it's called Robbie. And so suddenly she is kind of, she spends all this time kind of thinking about how it obviously has to be this. And we get this really interesting insight into her mind, because she's such a sort of busybody kind of character, and she's busy trying to write these stories and plays and whatever. And so we hear everything from her perspective, and we start to be able to read between the lines because we understand a tiny bit more. And she starts doing things to kind of mess up this relationship, because as she sees it, you know, he's a terrible man. He's been really destructive. But we then find out a little bit later that there's a kind of backstory between her and this boyfriend, because she had a sort of girl, like a sort of childhood crush on this man. And then when that was sort of rebuffed, she became quite spiteful about him. So suddenly it's quite an interesting thing, because it's not only her being unreliable because of her age, but her age and being sort of spurned as a lover, or whatever, is also kind of makes her quite angry and quite bitter, and sort of as a result quite destructive. And so she she does destroy a large part of this man's life because of that. And indeed the title of the book, Atonement, is about that very idea, that she spends the second half of the book trying to atone for her sins. And so actually suddenly she's a lot more reliable, because she's caught up with us. She gets what's happening. And I think that's a really interesting twist on the unreliable narrator, to make them get it. Although she doesn't always fully get it, she's a lot more along than she was at the beginning of the book. And it sets up such an interesting second half that I just think is brilliant. And I really, really appreciate this book. And that in some ways brings me to another character who I adore. I had forgotten about this book for a really long time, and then in a writing group I was part of recently, we looked at an excerpt, and I'd forgotten just how good this book is, and I desperately need to go back and reread it. And that is Notes on a Scandal by Zoe Heller. Oh, this book is incredible. It's so tight and brilliant. And sort of interesting tidbit that I found out through the writing group is that so when Zoe Heller originally wrote this book, this character Barbara, played by Judi Dench in the film adaptation, who was brilliant. This character Barbara is this sort of older woman who watches everything taking place, and we hear almost all of it through kind of diary entries of hers. Now, at first you would think that a diary would be incredibly reliable, in the sense that you're not hiding anything. You know, a diary is where you tell your secrets, and so you can be incredibly open with this in this form. You know, your diary wouldn't lie in theory, and that's exactly what this book sets up in such a really fun and interesting way. Barbara is so convinced of not only her own sense of truth, but is also so passionate and bitter in some other ways that she wants to destroy various things around her, and acts therefore in a way that will sort of almost strategically set her up best. So it feels almost like this character Barbara is playing a game of chess all the way through. And so she's moving around other characters or other situations to work out exactly right for her, to protect her, the queen, in this slightly long-winded attempt at a sort of metaphor or whatever here, this sort of analogy. But I think that's exactly how it feels. And so it's great because we realise at sort of quite critical points how unreliable she is. but it's also really fun because although she's really bitter and destructive, we're hearing it all in such a fun, exciting voice. And I mean, I love this book. I need to reread it because it's been a long time. I think I read it again probably not long after it came out, and it's brilliant. Including as well because it's all written through her eyes. She's a very sort of particular type of kind of upper middle class woman from a very specific time, and so she describes this woman as being low, as kind of way, you know, like, oh, she's, you know, she's done some bad things, but also at one point she's trying to describe someone as being fat, and she describes them as pantagruelian. And I remember looking that up as like an 18-year-old or whatever, and being like, this is brilliant. Like, I love that her way of calling someone fat is to literally compare them to sort of a mythical kind of Greek, I think it's Greek, kind of figure who was incredibly big. And it's brilliant. But yes, the unreliable nature of Barbara is what really sells this book. And so, yeah, fun tidbit. Sorry, I went really off on a tangent here. The fun tidbit about this book is when Zoe Heller was writing this, originally Barbara was not going to have a big role in the story, but the book wasn't working every time Zoe rewrote it. And I think it was something like her 7th draft. She gave Barbara more of a role and kind of told the story through the diaries, and suddenly everything falls into place because now we are watching the scandal. We're having these notes on it from Barbara, and we see these things sort of through her eyes and sort of start working out what the truth is and where things are being manipulated all around her. And it's just brilliant. It's so good. And so I really love that kind of just destroying things in my room. I really love that kind of unreliable character where they're just so like full of scorn and bitterness, and that really can sell a story if done well. Next up is a writer who I absolutely adore, and in so many of his short stories and his novels, characters are unreliable for a whole set of reasons, and that is the work of Franz Kafka. I adore him. He is, for me, he was a kind of a complete groundbreaker, where, like, I remember reading Kafka when I was, I think, genuinely about 17 or 18, and it blew my mind because I had no idea that literature could do this. I remember reading Metamorphosis and just thinking, like, where has this been all my life? This is remarkable. I remember the school librarian describing Kafka as being dull as ditch water, and me being personally offended on Kafka's behalf, being like, how dare you? And then when I travelled, remember that, travelling? When I travelled to Prague a while back, I spent the whole time I was there pretty much going to anything Kafka related in the city, because he used to live there. I went to the Kafka Museum, which is sort of like his old house. I went to even a Kafka themed restaurant, which was really not that Kafka related. There's a Kafka related bookshop. I went to so many parts and I absolutely adored it. It's I love him. Anyway, but what is so special about his characters' unreliability is often they're caught in an absolute web that they cannot understand. So if you think about something like The Trial, he's unreliable in quite a strange way, because in many ways he's very kind of straight to the point and focused, and the world around him is the incredibly unreliable thing. But we start to get the idea that maybe there's a bit more under the surface, that maybe he has done things that we don't know about, but maybe it's just kind of unfairly been pinpointed on him, and it's now raining, which is fitting. Maybe hopefully that won't be too distracting in the background sound-wise. And yeah, but then in loads of the short stories, you've got characters who are just so almost cold and detached from the rest of the world that they're unreliable almost by proxy, because they almost don't seem human. So they sort of say that things are happening in a very blunt, straight to the point way, and we just have to kind of take it for granted that they are that what they're saying is right, but we also kind of know that there's maybe a bit more to it all the way around. So Kafka is a bit of a weird example for some of these, but I think he's so brilliant at kind of catching stories and characters where nothing really makes sense and nothing's really that real, so everything's unreliable. And so we just have to sort of put together the pieces wherever we can, and I love that, and it's really fun. one as well that's kind of similar in some ways that people have pointed out, and I realize this is a very weird comparison to make between Kafka and and the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. In some ways, that narrator is unreliable for the same reason that the child in Room by Emma Donoghue is unreliable, which is that they don't have full knowledge of the world around them. But I do kind of think that there's something also quite special about Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, because the character is so, in some ways, detached from various parts of the world that we understand the world around them, but it's not a malicious kind of unreliable narrator. They just genuinely don't understand some things that are going on around them, and we as an audience piece those things together fairly quickly. Whereas, you know, for example, A Sense of an Ending, we piece it together a little bit later in the book in some ways because it's been set up as a twist. Whereas in Curious Incident, we kind of know not to fully... trust is maybe not the right word. We kind of know to look beyond what they're saying fairly early on. And that is really quite special because we as an audience then kind of juggle these two narratives. And I think it's really fun because we see that the kind of the given narration is then almost like a commentary on the real situation. So, you know, regularly most of us see this, but this character sees this thing, and that maybe gets us to think a little bit more about the thing that we often see. So I really love that, and I think it's really, really quite special. And you didn't think I would let you get away without another Booker Prize winner, did you? So again, an absolute favourite book of mine from one of my favourite authors. He hasn't released too many books actually, but is a writer who I just, pretty much every time I read his books, I kind of go into them thinking, oh, you know, let's see how this goes. And then fall head over heels in love with them and kind of think, oh, you clever man, you. And that's Life of Pi by Yann Martel. I don't know what that fish shake, damn you, Yann Martel, for being clever. Yes, I got distracted by my own sort of fist shaking there. Life of Pi, which won the Booker Prize in 2003, I think. Yes, 2003. And what I think is just so brilliant and special about this book is the way the unreliable narrator's part comes in, for me, is so clever because it's completely a twist. At least the first time you read the book, you do not see it coming. But the unreliable narrator aspect adds weight to both the real story and the not real story. And then as a result, really adds to the theme of the book, which is around stories and different retellings. So let's start from the beginning. Life of Pi, we are introduced to this character, Pi Patel, who is, we kind of soon realize, is talking to investigators, sort of detectives or whatever, to explain his situation. And what we find out that the story is that he is on a boat that then sinks, and he sort of finds himself woken up on a little mini escape boat with an array of wild animals. So I think there's a zebra. There are a few other animals, but crucially there is a tiger. And this tiger, at the heart of it, everything else dies, mostly because the tiger eats them. But a few other animals die from, you know, injuries or hunger or whatever. And so eventually it's just this young boy alone on a boat with a tiger. And so when he gets to the end of the story, when he meets these detectives, they kind of ask, how did you survive on a boat with a tiger? And they tell him, you know, they ask him, you know, could your story really be real? Like, that can't happen. How could anyone possibly survive on a boat with a tiger for that long without getting eaten? And, you know, he's kind of is sort of saying, oh, but no, you know, I sort of made peace offerings to this tiger. We found a way of coexisting. And meanwhile, in the book, there are loads of discussions around religion and around animals coexisting with each other, and about how various religions tell the story of creation or the story of how the world began in their own different ways. And there's some kind of commonality between some of their stories, but there are some parts that are wildly different. And this character talks a lot about, you know, early on we get this idea that he describes himself as having all of these different religions. So he's a sort of Hindu, and he's Muslim, and he's Christian at the same time, because he likes their stories. And we don't necessarily think too much of that at the beginning of the book. We just kind of think, oh, he likes all these stories, he's a bit of a quirky character, whatever. And then when we get towards the end of the book, it all becomes clear. Now, this is where a big spoiler is about to come in for Life of Pi, so maybe skip a couple of minutes if you haven't read it and don't know anything about the spoiler. So 3, 2, 1. So the spoiler is that we are then presented with a second story at the end of the book, where the character reveals potentially that he wasn't ever on board with a tiger at all. That indeed all of the animals on the boat were actually people, and that this character, Pai Patel, imagined everybody as animals because that was the only way he could survive the horrors of what was going on around him. And suddenly what was, this really fantastical tale full of these beautiful images of, swimming fish and the survival story with a tiger is suddenly really complicated, because now do we think that the tiger story is real or that these were real people? Both of them have massive ramifications. He either survived being being with a tiger, and that's the story we've had for like 300 pages by this point, or do we believe that that was his way of avoiding thinking about the horrible, traumatic reality of watching people, eat each other, kind of cannibalistically, of him having to watch people die in front of him, of these horrible choices having to be made with these people in front of him. Do we believe that story? And what makes that even more special as an unreliable narrator is when he's talking to these detectives at the end, he is kind of trying to outsmart them almost, it seems, or it's almost as if he doesn't really want to give a straight story. So when they ask him, is this story real? He's kind of a bit evasive, and he sort of says, well, what story is real? All stories are made up in some form. And he is really playful around this idea of a real story. Like, what does it mean to be real, to be true? What religion has given a true story, if they disagree with each other, but they're both saying that they are the word of God or whatever. And it's so interesting. And I adore the way this book does it, because it just flips it in such a clever way right towards the end. And I remember getting to the end of this book and just sort of being mind blown, because I was like, oh yeah, Yann Martel, you have literally you've led me down a path for 300 odd pages, and then right towards the end you've kind of twisted it, and now I'm genuinely worried about this character and quite concerned, and think this has actually been a really tragic tale, not this really beautiful tale of survival. But then we don't know which story necessarily to believe. Is he telling the more realistic story to the detectives because that will get them off his case? Like, if he tells them the real story, of it actually having been a tiger, they don't believe him. But if he tells them the fake story that seems more realistic and more plausible, then they believe him. And so we don't know quite where he's at in that. It also, side point, The Life of Pi does one of my favourite silly things in a book ever, which is it has a chapter that is literally 2 words long, which I think is like chapter 97 or 98. The whole book is exactly 100 chapters, which is very satisfying. But at one point, the detectives say, tell us your story, and that's like chapter 96 or whatever, 97. The next chapter, it just says, the story, and then it goes chapter 99, which I just think is hilarious, because it's he could then spend the whole thing kind of being like, here is the outline of all my story, or he could have ended the previous chapter just saying, and then I told them the story, and then move on. But I love that chapter 98 or whatever it is just the story. There we go. And again, that really plays into this idea of what is real, what is not, which I just think is so clever and so brilliant, and just fills me with joy every single time. I love this book. I need to reread it, and probably will have to soon for going over the Booker Prize shortlist for that one. But either way, it's such a great book, and I really do urge you to check it out. So that brings me to the end of these books that I'm talking about with Unreliable Narrators. Now, I would love for you to recommend any unreliable narrators that you know, or that you've read, or a story that's done this in a particularly clever way. So whether that's a character who is so blind to their own failings or to their own lack of knowledge, whether it's a character who is too young to fully understand the story, whether it's a character who maliciously does it or does it for self-preservation. I'm so fascinated by the concept of an unreliable narrator and just what it can add to a story when it's done well, because suddenly it can be the biggest twist in the story. It can make you think a lot more deeply about what is true. And it can really make you question a lot of things around you. So I'd love to hear any more of your thoughts, and please do let me know. But either way, I hope you've enjoyed this. I've been Bob the Brookerer, and I've been hopefully somewhat reliable for this video, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, and take care. Enjoy your reading. Bye bye.